North Carolina actually suffered a really bad flooding in the storm in September, and people are still struggling for that. I'm walking in a house that was flooded 6 inches got into this house. Now that doesn't sound like that much, but let me show you where this house is. This house is 13 feet above the ground. 13 feet! And it flooded 6 inches. This is a huge wide open space. That was a lot of water. I am so glad that I don't work for James Bond anymore. And yes, I actually used to work for James Bond. True story. So today we're going to be talking about time lapses, but more specifically I want to show you a way that I found that you can get long exposure time lapses, because for what I just did, a time lapse like that looks really good, but that doesn't have any motion blur, and the lack of motion blur in that shot is what makes a time lapse for something like that actually look good. But usually we want to have motion blur in our shots. You see, if we were doing more of a standard vehicles passing by type of a time lapse, then we would have an issue where, because we're using a time-lapse movie mode, it would look something like this. But when you're doing a long exposure time-lapse, you get that motion blur and it looks like this. Now, of course, that's not an excessive amount of motion blur, and the best way to do time-lapse is to get raw photos, put them through a program that's made for making time-lapses, but trying to get a little bit of a long exposure time-lapse for like a vlog, I think this method works really well, actually. Now, of course, I feel like I have to say that I don't know much about time-lapses. I've probably done maybe less than 24 time lapses since I've been doing filmmaking. But as I learn more and more about filmmaking, I learn how powerful of a tool time lapses are, so I'm trying to get into it. So if you're wondering, why haven't I done a video on time lapses? That's why. I just don't know how. But I did want to share with you, since I got this question about long exposure time lapse, I wanted to share with you the little hack that I figured out to get a little bit of a long exposure time lapse without having to take photos the entire time. And you can do this in 4K or 1080p. Now, first of all, you set your camera into 24 frames per second. You can either do that in 1080p or 4K. Next, you want to set your shutter speed. Now, if you don't know what shutter speed is, it looks like this on your screen. Now, normally when we're shooting in 24 frames per second, your shutter speed is set to 1/50th of a second. What you want to do is you want to dial that down all the way to 1/8 of a second, and that's what's going to introduce the motion blur. Now, what you'll realize immediately when you do that is it's going to make the image way brighter. Like, you are letting in so much more light, and so what you have to do is you have to compensate with your other exposure values. Lower your ISO, it looks like this on your screen. Lower that down probably all the way, and then you want to raise your aperture, and that looks like this on your screen. And you want to raise that. I had to raise it up to f11, but I had a variable ND filter. But if you got to stop down all the way to f22, that's totally fine, not a big deal. Just go ahead and do it. It'll be a regular 24 frames per second file, and it'll look like this when you're done. This looks horrible. It doesn't look good at all. But when we speed this up, I'm speeding it up to about 32 times, it looks like this. And in my opinion, it looks just way better for that type of a time lapse, having the motion blur in it. Now again, it's not always something that you want. You don't always want to have a lot of motion blur. The one I did today at work, if I would have had motion blur, I really don't think it would have looked as good. So having me in focus, having it so you see me as a subject moving around, I think worked for that particular type of a time lapse. So this isn't a be-all end-all. If you're trying to get one of the night time lapses where you have the light trail streaming through your video, you're not gonna be able to do that with the normal time lapse mode. That will look something like this. Okay, for the record, a small town at 10 at night is not the best place for a nighttime long exposure time lapse. Sorry, I'm not going to be able to get any actual test shots today. I'll put one in a future video. Whereas with the motion blur, 1/8 of a second, speeding up a regular video, that is just gonna look much better. You're gonna get at least a little bit of that motion blur light trails through your footage. So that is my M50 long exposure time-lapse hack. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and I'll see you all in the next video.